yeah, I'm super honored and delighted to have Ruben from To Readers It May Concern with me today. We've been discussing the idea of this video for a few weeks, and it's just been so much fun just talking about books and literature and booktube and poetry in the last few weeks. And yeah, so Ruben he's an editor. He has edited the LA-based poetry anthology Coiled Serpent, Poets Arising from the Cultural Quakes and Shifts of Los Angeles, as well as a bunch of other books by really good poets and writers. He's also a teacher, and he is the face and the brains behind To Readers It May Concern, which I'm going to leave a link to it here. I'm going to do the little box in the corner, but it's an amazing YouTube channel. I really think that he's brought so much freshness to the booktube sphere with his deep, winding thoughts about so many interesting topics around books and literature. So yeah, I'm super stoked and honored to have you here with me today, Ruben. So yeah, thanks a lot.
Thanks so much. It's honestly a real honor to be able to do this. I feel so grateful that you invited me at all. In many ways, I'm really just a co-host with you to celebrate the launch of your latest poetry collection, Blue Remembered Star. I don't know if that's faded. We'll have to just put it on the screen. Yeah. So, Bren Booth Jones is an Irish South African writer, editor, and producer of Across the River and Into the Books. Today we are celebrating Bren's third full-length poetry collection, Blue Remembered Star, published today by Hedgehog Poetry. Bren's debut collection, Vertigo to Go, won the 2019 White Label competition and was published by Hedgehog. His second book, Open Letters to the Sky, was published in 2022 by the same press. He has co-edited several books and journals, including As Much Heart as a Vending Machine, published by the Hungry Ghost Project in 2021. He has also collaborated with an array of artists, including Laura A. Diemer, Noor Disco, and Noortje Stortelder. Bren's poems and prose have appeared in Die Optimist, Dutch Design Week, Open Letters Review, and elsewhere. He lives in Holland. Today we're going to discuss some of your poems, but really we're going to discuss you as a poet. And I'm so curious to understand you better as a poet. There's so much that I've gotten as I've been reading through the different poems in your latest collection that have felt to me familiar in their wandering and also highly complex in the kind of contending with both memory and loss and searching for home. And so many of these pieces feel even more personal than the ones in the earlier collection. But also, it seems like you have found your way to use that metatextual play in a way that feels like you are being very real about what it is to be a poet and the kind of mind that a poet has and some of the distance that having a mind of a poet can deliver when it comes to dealing with other people. And so I'm so excited to talk about these pieces with you.
Thanks,
should
man.
I give your bio?
Yeah, it's really super beautifully put. And yeah, we actually talked about this David Foster Wallace and Michael Silverblatt conversations, and I'm not comparing either of us to either of them in any way. Just that, yeah, just there's this moment when David Foster Wallace is like, you just ask the right questions, you say the right things about my work to Silverblatt, and I don't know, I just really appreciate the way that you talk about these books, and yeah, I think that's a good track to get started on for sure.
Let's familiarize the viewers with what it is that you're doing here in this first collection, and you're going to read probably the first poem, right?
Yeah.
In this piece.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to read the first poem in Blue Remembered Star. It's missing parenthesis. It just seems like a fitting place to start our discussion. Missing parenthesis. Before first light, coffee so hot, it leaves my tongue furry and white. Engine on, then I'm driving madly back. A tiny spider clings to the side mirror like a wobbly star. My love, you are the missing parenthesis. Missing wing, missing bliss. Barrier dividing road from cliff. My knuckles are white, gripping the wheel. Such speed whips pre-dawn fields and farms away. Whole cities quiver and vanish in the dark like fish. My longing a comet, my plunge a wish.
I noticed when you read that out loud, that sudden rhyme at the very bottom of that poem. My whole cities quiver and vanish in the dark like fish. My longing a comment, my plunge a wish. And I only bring that up just very lightly, just to point out how it adds this little hint of momentum to that final feeling of wanting to plunge out into the dark.
Definitely. I love that you touched on that. I feel like I talk about T.S. Eliot way too much, especially considering that my values don't really align with his in many ways, but he was obviously like just brilliant. And, as a young poet, like reading poetics and criticism, I think Eliot has a lot to teach one. But he has this really catty, pretentious, scathing review that he wrote in 1917 for the New Statesman on vers libre, like on free verse. He says that actually there's an amazing power in free verse, and it's not because rhyming has been thrown away. It's actually because rhyming is more potent, right? If every line is rhyming, you kind of, I think he says, like, our ears are thick with the rhyming of the English poetic tradition. But he talks about how, if you can have a rhyme in unrhymed, in free form verse, and then it's this binding, it's making an interesting contrast, or like you say, it's changing the direction of the poem at the end. It's almost like functioning like a volta or something. So
yeah, that's fascinating how you take note of that emphasis in sound when it's necessary to a poem. And for this particular poem, because it seems to be circling around this desire to fall, right, to actually give up yourself and to pass away, to have that emphasis be the kind of completion of rhyme, the way that rhyme is essentially completing what has been built up by the prior line. And it brings back to me the value of free verse, because free verse escapes from meter in the sense that there's not this syllabic requirement or this requirement of stress. And so then the distinction then in free verse from prose is in the line break, right? The
Definitely.
tension of the line break and either the break from satisfaction or the delivery of satisfaction. And the fact that you have this constant breaking from expectation throughout the whole poem, it's sort of like it's not rhyming. It uses alliteration quite a lot, but it doesn't use as much clear, obvious consonants or assonants. So it's sort of like this like wobbly, just like the wobbly star of the spider kind of feel through the whole thing. And then those final two lines hit. And that feels to me so striking. And I bring up that wobbly star of that spider. And obviously that's the central image in this poem, this wobbly star. And it brings to mind the title of this book. So, one of my questions to you is, why Blue Remembered Star? What is this feeling of a star? Why title the whole book around a star? There's obviously the illumination from the star. There's a sense of guidance from a star. But what is your feel on that?
Definitely. No, that's it. I mean, so we talked about this before, about this A.E. Housman poem and this line of Blue Remembered Hills. And he writes very sort of poignantly and with a sense of wistful longing for this sort of idyllic, forgotten past. And I think it was very easy to read it from the perspective of being like a soldier in Flanders or something, like thinking of your English Shire and never being able to go back there. Which brings in the question of home, which we're going to come to as well later on. I've been thinking about that question a lot. But this Blue Remembered Hills is his line, and I just read it. I just happened to be reading some Housman. This line just really got stuck in my head, but then I started to sort of just give it, I don't know, I just started thinking of Blue Remembered Star, and then of course all of these connotations, like you're completely on point about this guiding light of a star. There's something positive about that, and how this my mother-in-law passed away during this period of composition of this book, and And yeah, that sense of loss didn't seem like a hill, seems like it's just over there. Like it didn't seem adequate to explicate like the massive void of someone very dear to you that that dies. And stars just felt like closer to the remove of death than a hill did. But then, yeah, like you say, it's also a positive thing. It's a guiding light, and her example. There's a poem dedicated to her in this book. We're not going to read it today, but Veneranda is her name. And yeah, she did set an amazing example for us in the way that she lived her life to the end. And yeah, it wasn't so conscious that I thought it's all linked through this idea of loss and stars as a guiding light, but it just kind of unconsciously came together in that way.
And there's a lot of pieces here where it does feel like, when we move away from this kind of dark night honesty in the first piece, there emerges some irony here and there, this kind of like distance. And I wonder if that next piece after this, the lovesick in the park, was that your way of kind of continuing that looking at yourself from afar and sort of seeing, because you're kind of making fun of yourself in that piece?
Definitely. I'm glad you picked up on that, because this ridiculous use of systemic, like, yeah, sometimes it's funny when you do readings or that kind of thing, or when you have a discussion or a book launch or whatever. It's just so interesting how different people pick up different things. I'm really glad you picked up on that, because yeah, it is definitely self-deprecating. And yeah, I think I sort of, sometimes it's quite helpful to have a constraint. Like I don't, we were just talking about free verse. I generally just write without trying to put too many limits on like my process. But at the same time, it's nice when you have a formal structure if you're thinking of putting together a book. So I had this deep dive into like English Renaissance, and then I was reading up about like Robert Burton's The Anatomy of Melancholy, 1628. Yeah, 1628. And the four humors. And then I was like, okay, there's some kind of thing here with the seasons relating to the different humors, and how in those medieval times it was all about balancing these liquids, these humors, these moods and sort of sensibilities. And I was like, well, that's also what we do when we write poems or when we read. We're trying to balance these sort of conflicting currents or very fluid elements. And so it just seemed like that was a good structure. And then it made sense to start with spring, or with spring is the blood, right? According to like this old, really wacko kind of pseudo medical stuff. And so love sick. So it starts with this imbalance, and maybe that's, we talked about this as well. Like I just I find that the problem I have with certain poems that I read, and like that includes poems that I write probably most of the time, is that like they start in a place of knowingness, and they're just too sure-footed, and then they don't really come alive and move. So I like to start lost and find my way somewhere, or start somewhere in a place of certainty and find my way into a kind of diaphanous lost space, and that there's something interesting in the movement of that. So to be lovesick is to be sort of over full with this effusion of love. So yeah, it starts from a place of imbalance, and I think there's a lot of humor in the funny. There's comic, there's something comic to be drawn from imbalance, because you're kind of bringing together things that don't really fit together and seeing what emerges from that. It's also wobbly, it's also off kilter, and that's when you surprise yourself in those ways. I think that's a good start.
Yeah, there's a nice setting the tone with this. Yeah, I was gonna say there's a nice setting of the tone here with this piece in contrast to the first one. So I would love it if you read The Lovesick in the Park for us, and then we can talk about a few of those kind of tragic sadness and humor in there.
Yeah, that's good. Lovesick in the Park. We lie in the green, white, and rose tumble of fresh and fragrant snow. of blossoms and cold spring sun, April in Holland, fumes and flowers, liquid light. Drunken bumblebees drone dizzily. Systemic cherry blossom downpour, I say. A disconsolate ant hikes the hillock of my shin. Surrounding the greenish, lovesick vacuum of this park, the city spills. Systemic neon, chrome sneer, trend and tumor mutating into muzak, melting into molten miasma, melding muddled motes. The whole goddamn glittering shit show we forced the earth to swallow. McAmsterdam and its million weed-riddled visitors. Digits fizzle in the binary guts of the machine. But that's not what systemic means, you say, unbuckling your satanic boots and laying back beside me. Above us, treetops thrive in April light. Above the trees, Boeings grope madly through the blue, deliver raving tourists into red hues and frightful highs. You smell of white wine and desire. An ant shoulders a crumb up the analogy of my ankle. Oh, little Sisyphus, must we keep up this systemic shopping? Little kids nearby on the grass are absorbed in skywriting, their fingers tracing caverns where the ozone used to be. They stitch their hearts into loopy, dissolving letters, a message stretched into airy thinness. It says something like this: Dear Mr. President, please keep our grandkids a freeze-dried leaf. Make history believable.
Yeah, this is a very strong piece reflecting the theme that you discussed of trying to find yourself as a poet, because you see yourself in this piece using this word systemic again and again, almost like you're trying to belong within a certain zeitgeist of how to communicate problems. And you use it incorrectly and you mock yourself through the voice of another beside you. And it makes me wonder, how do you make the decision when to poke fun at something very sincere like that? Because it is an understandable effort. You know, we're trying to use these words, we're trying to belong, we're trying to connect with others, especially as a poet. There's this desire to have something to say, something of worth to say. And rather than communicate it straight in the sense of very directly telling us, oh, I'm struggling with what to say, you're showing us through this kind of mockery the embarrassment of misusing this sort of language. Like, why was that choice made in this case?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, I mean, I really appreciate the way that you read into that. Yeah, I think Tony Hoagland puts it really well. He's like, we're terrified. We don't know what we're doing. We hurt the people we love when we don't mean to. We hurt ourselves, and like we're all gonna die. Like that's like this channel of morbidity or darkness. But at the same time, like we can always, like we can joke about it. You know, we can laugh about it. We can laugh at the absurdity of it. And we should, because that is a powerful, a way of dealing with reality. And I think I don't want to portray some like smooth, suave, like flawlessness or something like that's, everything is cracked and that's how the light gets in. Somebody said that. I don't know who said that, but yeah, you're right. Systemic is a very zeitgeisty word. And so it is a critical poem. It is critical of like these, global forces that none of us can control, that, and we can't even really wrap our heads around like the language. We can't even put into terms these giant interconnected, what Timothy Morton would probably call hyper object. But yeah, I just have fun with it. Like it's got to be enjoyable, and I stumble over my words a lot. So systemic seemed like a good word to just get obsessed by.
There is a poem in here that feels very different than a lot of the other ones in terms of its driving force. Like it's not quite as softly cadenced as some of the other ones, and that is the "Didn't I Blow Your Mind This Time" piece. I wonder, do you want to read that? It is noticeably very different from a lot of your other pieces, and I want to talk to you about that choice.
Yeah, no, I'm really happy to read that one, because I just like it. It's a prose poem. It's so intertextual because I was like reading this excerpt of this like long forgotten playwright, Arthur Murphy, 17th century. He's long forgotten, he's out of print, but Graham Greene was like quoting like a chunk of his of some social commentary that he wrote, and I just really like the rhetoric of it. So I was like, I'm going to borrow that. Of course, I credit where it came from, but I just twisted it and turned it and added things and took things out, and but yeah, I just like that it's an unexpected rhetorical register that I think sort of overlays that serious register with just like having fun. So and maybe I'm explaining it before I've read it. Let me read it first. Didn't I blow your mind this time? Didn't I? Didn't I go into Parliament to please you? Didn't I toil, till, and titter through Twitter in search of a glimmer of better? And didn't the litter on the street of the world's bitterness only thicken? Did I not go down into the mines of pitch black forgetting to chisel a shard of semi-precious vision? And when I scrambled back up into the light with a coal-smeared smile and marketable lightning bolts, wasn't I pelted with cabbages and forced to flee the village in a rabbit cart? So it goes. Didn't I multiply a few cheeseburgers into an empire to wire 5,000 cows a minute into a million worldwide mouths? Was it not I who performed as the monochromatic mime to entertain your howling and dictatorial toddlers? I who danced before the pearly gates in nothing but my vegan Doc Marten boots to prove, once and for all, that every poem needs a hero.
Makes me wonder the voice in this. It sounds like so many of the objects that you're describing sound like corporate attempts to please, or like look at all these goods that we've delivered you for you to consume and appreciate.
Yeah, I think it's pretty. I think I mean it pretty ironically. I think that I just don't really like. I try my hardest not to be self-righteous, and I think I'm just playing with that notion of like, I look outside and I see trees, the leaves are falling off the trees, and I just think of death and how hard my life is. Like, you've done a lot of editing. I've edited magazines and stuff, and sometimes you get these really anguished poems, and I just think, it's not the amount of anguish that you can funnel into a poem that makes it good. And I think, yeah, so I'm just playing with that, like, didn't I do this? Didn't I do that? Like, haven't I proved that like I'm a hero? And it's really meant ironically. It's it's anaphoric in these repetitions, because I was kind of taking that highfalutin 17th century rhetoric and just kind of turning it inside out. At least that's what I was trying to do.
Yeah, so it almost sounds like you've exaggerated some of the efforts to have one's sacrifices be seen, right?
Such exaggeration. And I think I was reading P.G. Wodehouse recently for my Penguin series, and like he's very good at just extravagant exaggerations, and I found that quite comic. So it's just over the top in its exaggerations. Like, I danced in front of all of these people, like I had my vegan boots on, I was digging through like through the earth to get to some deeper meaning. It's just like so over the top. So hopefully that's how it comes across, because I definitely don't mean it in like some kind of personal claim for some deeper level of poetic intuition or something like that.
Yeah. Between the first book and this one,
Mm-hmm.
how have you changed or grown in your view as a poet? Like, what is different about your priorities, where you're putting your attention? So much of poetry is about attention. So what is holding your purview when you're writing these pieces now compared to before?
Yeah, so it's a nice way to sort of reflect on that growth. It's a difficult question to answer. But yeah, I think as you get a bit older and more experienced as a writer, but also just as a human, you kind of, that the angstometer kind of goes down. So I think that Yeah, and maybe when I talk about like self-righteousness being a bad thing, maybe I'm talking about my earlier self and something that I'm striving not to be, because I think in some of those poems I was trying too hard to show like sort of um, political astuteness or something like that. But I also don't want to be too harsh on my younger self. So I think there's also a kind of naivety, because you're writing poems, but you never think you're actually going to have a book. So that's nice. You're just, there's a kind of organic energy to it in a way. I'm just not trying to please anyone. I hope people like my poems. I'm just trying to get through life and love the people that mean the most to me, and try and be a decent person and learn as much as I can. And in a way, these poems emerged from a place of peace, where I was not like trying to be like, here comes the next Bren Booth Jones poem, or something like ridiculous like that. So not that I was doing that earlier, but you grow and you shift and you just try and also just keep learning. I mean, I'll always be a student of poetry and of literature. I just love it so much, and I just love to read. And then at some point, I'm just like bubbling up, and I just need to get these things out. So it's kind of organic, and maybe that's where it's gone from being unexpected that it becomes a book to now it's know that, okay, there's a chance that this will become a book, but I'm just letting go of trying to be something.
Yeah, as you're saying this, it actually makes me realize that there was a lot more straightforward narrative in your earlier books, and this one seems much more about narrative. They're sort of like looking at how we narrate our life, such as in Lovesick in the Park, which we read before, how we can sometimes exaggerate our own story in order to please or to get an applause, which is the piece you just read. And it's this sort of feeling of like, let me look at how I was constructing story and let me find myself as a poet in a different way than before. Would you say that that's accurate? Like, is this sort of your new kind of experimentation with being a poet?
Yeah, I think that sums it up very well. It is a reflection more on, on narrative itself. We have limited time and energy, so I just want to write from a place of like openness, and openness to new ideas, openness to other people's perspectives and cultural differences, and just like, it's just like there's such a freedom in learning, and there's such a beautiful freedom in literature. You can explore all of these other worlds um, through other people's eyes, and that interiority is just so profound, and you don't get that in other mediums. So I guess that guides me in terms of my own writing. But yeah, try not to constrain myself. Try to see where it goes. Try to be lost. Getting lost is a good thing. You have to find your way out of that. Wallace Stevens has this, what he talks about, like the irrational element in poetry. And for him, the irrational is that every person has a sensibility, and your sensibility is the filter through which like you receive your contact with the world. Like this raw data of perception comes through, and you don't really think, I'm gonna make a poem about he uses the example of a cat walking over frozen grass at night, and this like light pattering outside of his window, and then he's like, that's the stimulus for a poem. But every person has a different sensibility, and so I just think, if you feel like you want to write a poem, and I always tell it to people as well, and anyone who's watching this, like, don't be scared of failure. Just like, if you feel the urge to write a poem, then you should just do it. And if you feel the urge to make a video talking about books, you should do that, or a story. So I will always do that, but I do also want to I want to work on some prose projects, like longer fiction and non-fiction as well. What about you?
Well, yeah, it's a great invitation that you just offered up to people to write. Because I think you really discover something about yourself when you actually have to put yourself down onto something tangible. And it makes me think about, what we're doing with our channels. I've been so lucky to have met you through creating a YouTube channel dedicated to books. And then I get to find a like-minded reader and writer, someone who cherishes language and what it can offer. and also questions the ways in which language can confine things. And then so it becomes more about how do we play with those conclusions that the boxed in form of language brings. And so much of your books feel like you contending and really kind of playing with like, okay, here is the language I have access to, here is the understanding I have, but then what is that added layer underneath that I can not communicate directly but play with? And that's where the humor and the kind of like hurt comes in back and forth.
Yeah, this idea of home, I'm actually glad we came onto this, because we were driving this week. We were on a road trip, and we were driving like to the east of the Netherlands, and I was driving, and Norsha was beside me, and I think she was maybe like taking a nap, and we were just driving through these like wide open fields. And Holland is very mild, sort of geographically. It's very flat, it's green fields and sort of damp bluish grayish sky. And I was just really struck with this question of home, because we were talking about this, and this was such an epiphany for me, that home for me is the English language. Like that is home for me. Like I was born in New Zealand, but I left there a long time ago. I have not been back very many times. I don't really, I have a passport, but I don't really consider myself to be a Kiwi. I was raised in South Africa, but my parents' backgrounds are very mixed. Through my dad, I have an Irish passport, but I wasn't born in Ireland. Officially, I'm Irish. That's how I can live in Europe. So I feel this real sort of floaty sense of like displacement, or just a unrootedness. But then I had this epiphany that like most of, and I feel very attached to certain people, and some of the people I love most are in South Africa. Some of them are here or in other places in the world. But that was a real realization for me just recently, and based on our conversations, that like it's the English language is really my home, and then literature is this manifestation of this very ever-changing, dynamic, gigantic hyper object of the English language. Literature is this like series of sort of signposts or markers of something tangible that you can hold. And that's why I just love to inhabit these characters or these thinkers, and spend time in their pages, because that is like a real groundedness. And then my own writing is my own sort of identification with this this language, and this kind of intangible but very real sense of belonging. And that was an important moment for me, and maybe that's why this book has these references to home, or returning, or going back, or finding things ironically less glittering than maybe some mythic story of the big return teaches us, right? And that was important for me. So I'm glad that had the chance to say that in relation to all of this we've been talking about.
Yeah,
And I want to ask you, I know that this is about my book and my reading, but I always like our conversations, and I'm just also curious about your own relationship with the English language, and your sense of your place as an intellectual living in America. Obviously, with your background is also not American in a normal sense, but what is American, right? Like America is a melting pot. So you don't have to go into it, but I'm curious to know what you feel your relationship is to the English language.
Yeah, for me, it's there's been a lot of transitions in my life. When I was very young, language was quite rough because I grew up in a rough area. And then after I was suddenly uprooted, it's funny you talk about uprootedness in your own life, but of course, I was uprooted out of a lower income family and into suddenly my father doing very well. And then it's like I'm transitioning to an entirely different culture and entirely different expectations. And with those expectations suddenly comes a change in my language. I remember I had a Chicago accent when I was very little, and when I went to middle school in California, they would always comment on the strangeness of the kind of abruptness at the end of my words and how I would use the word pop instead of saying soda, things like that. And it suddenly made me aware of language in a way that I never was before. I never thought of myself as having an accent, right? We never think of ourselves as having an accent because it is our voice and it's really everyone else who has an accent. But of course, accents are universal in the sense that it's always relative to who's hearing you. And so suddenly I began to see myself relative to others' eyes and others' ears. And I think that is the birth of being a writer and being a poet, is you start to discover the distinctness of your voice, and then you start to cherish it and see it. You start to empathize with others' ears and others' eyes rather than resist it. I could have just closed down and stayed silent out of a kind of embarrassment. And this is actually one of those things that I find so comforting while reading your poetry is I hear so much of a similar kind of tugging with language. We read that piece earlier, Lovesick in the Park, about how someone was pointing out to you your misuse of systemic. And it reminds me so much of that kind of person I am, of always striving for the right words, but needing to adopt others' words and then recognizing suddenly there's a misuse of context within those words. And that was so much of my learning experience when I went from Chicago to California, this low income to higher income class. Suddenly, like, words are a form of judgment on you, how you're using them. And so I hear those kinds of sense of judgment from other people in some of your pieces. And that to me is so familiar. And that's why I said I recently did a video on the books I've been reading, and I mentioned reading your books. And I make this little point about how you have this line about in the midst of our small talk, there are aquifers of why. And I say that in the midst of the small talk of your verse, I find aquifers of myself. I find underneath in the subtext of the language hints of myself. And I think there's a commonality, it seems, between both of us, in that we're always searching for ways to use language for ourselves.
Yeah.
Is it strange hearing interpretations of your piece in that way? Like when I connect it to myself in that way, does that feel surprising to you? Does it feel fitting? How does it feel when other people are making these kinds of interpretations and judgments on your pieces like that?
Well, I mean, I think that you're, and this is why your channel is so richly rewarding. And anyone who's watching this, please go and look at Ruben's channel. I've said it a couple of times, but I don't care. I'm going to say it again. Like and it's so interesting to hear this roots of your switch from Chicago to LA, and how there was this kind of conscious pressure on the way that you spoke, and how there was like this sort of closing in of this external pressure to conform, and how you were able to navigate your way to a sense of your own idiosyncrasies and acceptance of your own voice. And I think that comes through so beautifully in videos that you make talking about literature, because, and I think I said this to you before, that the way that you express yourself is like inhalations and exhalations of thought, and that is something that is really not easy to do, and not everybody has that. I think sometimes people, I mean, I speak for myself, sometimes I feel like I'm trying to shovel everything in together, but you have a kind of magisterial flow and rhythm to your ideas, and I can see that, having gone through those changes in your family, socioeconomic status, and being uprooted again, that word, to a new locale, how that sharpened your sense of the importance of language to sort of outline your own parameters and define on your own terms, like who you are and how you navigate the world, and how you discover like new avenues of personal growth, or like philosophical understanding. And I think that's really, really, really cool. Yeah, having these discussions with you, I mean, I really appreciate very much the way that the time and the attention that you have given to reading my text. So I really appreciate that a lot. Maybe we should jump along.
Yeah, no, I'm so grateful for your kind words to me in regards to your book. I really enjoyed reading very carefully your books. I think I've read them like 7 times now, all 3 of them, just sort of again and again and again and again. It's been my morning read each day. And
yeah, we talked about this in one of our other conversations about like the attunement, you know, and Heidegger's idea of like ready to hand, like we live with all of these objects around us ready to hand. But poetry can help, and literature in general, to make things present at hand, to really attune us to our surroundings. And I think that maybe this poem speaks a little bit to that. So it's a Winter Walk at Dusk, and I've got an epigraph from Denis Levertov, which says, "Thrust close." Blah, 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 blah. Try again. An epigraph from Denis Levertov, which says, "Thrust close your smile that we know you, terrible joy. A mile from here the earth crackles and groans under the lash of 8-lane highways. Already investors and hustlers rustle and scurry in the undergrowth along this country lane. But the cold air smells of moss and smoke. Rumors of sun fade in the bare and shadowy calligraphy of trees. Cloud castles overhead erupt into mottled pink and mauve mammoths, then drain into dissolving dusk. Twilight. A lithe cipher of high pale moon appears. Out of nowhere a terrible joy rises. Birds converge and then starburst beyond the trees and scatter over the darkening river. When will these silky feathered comets head south? Isn't it too late? The bright malarial gate of the equator smelted shut. Or do they live like me, so deep in my flock of delusions, mistaking north for south, pills for peace, litter for lizards, bullets for bees? I look around, dismayed. The joy has fled without a trace. But I've no little horse to give his bells a shake. The muddy path alone awaits, blurry with dark. But then a tiny bird breaks off from the rest, like a deviant parenthesis, swoops straight at me and plunges through my eye and bursts into a torrent of dark glowing song in my head, singing, "Give up looking for signs, give up, give up, give up, and you'll learn to navigate by touch."
I love the echo that this piece has with the very first opening piece. You bring up parentheses again, and this time it's the birds who are the parentheses, but these tiny birds are telling you to not look for these signs anymore, to not rely on those same symbols in order to avoid the plunge that you feel. And there is this kind of plunging that's in the beginning of this piece where it feels like you're getting lost in the beauty of the world, but you also have this self-awareness, or rather more just a full awareness of the constraints of the society that you live in and some of the costs of that society with the investors and all of the hustling that they do for product.
You're so on point. You really, really, you pick up on those fine little, elements that.
And I'm not sure how intentional it is. The beautiful thing about poetry is sometimes it reveals these little unconscious elements of our lives. But
Yeah.
it really struck me as like, oh, this feels so rounded from the beginning of this piece, of this book.
Yeah.
And it makes this final book that you have, this most recent release, not final, of course.
No, hopefully not.
It makes your most recent collection feel really whole.
Yeah, I think also, and Blue Remembered Stars, like you're even in the dark, that you have stars to navigate by. Yeah, man, I really appreciate you doing this with me, and it's I hope that people watching get some enjoyment out of it. It's been super, super, super great, and I feel like I want to start like a series of conversations on my channel or something, but you've set the bar so bloody high, so we'll have to see about that. Thanks a lot. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you. Your book has served as its own kind of star of guidance for me. It's been something that's very easy to flow through, and the connections when they hit, it makes everything like reflective. It's like new. It's like, oh, I'm seeing bits of myself in a different way, and it's really, really powerful. So I'm so appreciative that you invited me. One, just so I could read your books. It was so great to read this book early, pre-release, and just to get this kind of feeling of, oh, I can see the kindling of this fire. Like, this is a really good book. This is going to be something that people are going to want to get, and I've distanced myself from poetry for a while. I grew up with poetry. For those who don't know, my dad is a poet and he became the poet laureate of Los Angeles for a while. So poetry was always around me. And so I think as, I don't know, maybe there's a knack for rebellion in all of us. And there's this feeling of like, well, I don't want to just consume myself in poetry. That's what my dad does, you know? And it was so nice to just, for this invite to read someone's poetry closely again, to have that person that I'm reading be a friend, to have this feeling of, oh, there's aspects of this friend that I would never have access to outside of the really, really etching deep cuts of writing onto the white page. And it is so nice to see that in you, to see that in this piece. And I can't wait for other people to read about you, through you, and what you're going through. And I'll maybe get a sense of their own guidance. Maybe they can begin to wander by touch, just like you've learned to.
I just want to thank Mark Davidson, the editor of Hedgehog Poetry, for believing in my work and publishing not one, not two, but three books. Mark is an incredible person. He's really just not someone who is wanting the limelight at all. All he wants to do is just just publish like books of poems. And he's given a kickstart to my own career and to so many other up and coming poets and established poets as well. He's got like a full range of stuff going on there at the Hedgehog Poetry Press. So I just had to say thank you, Mark, so much, and thank you, Ruben, so much for coming and doing this with me. And yeah, like I think the best thing about this whole thing has been like making a friend, and like I'm talking to my girlfriend like for like hours afterwards about all of the cool things we talked about in our chats. So yeah, really cool to do this with you, and thanks very much.